I love the Joker profile picture there, Catherine. So, Catherine, who did you like better for Joker? Joaquin Phoenix or Heath Ledger? Just curious. I think they were both pretty damn good. All right. Yeah, I agree. It's kind of a tough call. So today we have our last class meeting together, and we're going to go ahead and cover chapter 15 today. It has honestly been a pleasure to be your instructor this semester. It's been a crazy semester, and I've never experienced anything quite like what we've been through this semester with the flexibility that we've had to exercise just regarding the way that we do things. The first time I've ever been through a global pandemic before, so hopefully it's the last. It took 35 years for it to happen in my life, so I'd be fine if it didn't happen for another 70 years. That'd be fine with me. Hopefully, we're able to get a vaccine and get this thing under control here pretty soon. Because I know a lot of folks are getting close to their breaking point with the social distancing and social isolation. Folks who work in the medical field, I know, are stressed out beyond belief. So, again, thank you all for being great students this semester. I do have a lot of grading that I'm working on getting caught up on right now. It's the end of the semester, so I appreciate everybody's patience. I'll have the final exam out for you guys tomorrow. I will publish that tomorrow. I am still finishing it up, but I anticipate that it will be somewhere between 50 to 60 multiple choice questions. And that it'll be open book, probably 50 to 60 multiple choice questions covering chapters 12 through 15. Excuse me. So we have chapter 12, I believe that's the chapter on social psychology, and then chapter 13 on personality, chapter 14 on mental illnesses, and chapter 15 on treatment, which we will cover today. And yes, study guide. There will be a study guide that I will publish. So you don't have to take it immediately as soon as it opens tomorrow. I'll have a study guide that I'll publish at the same time, and the exam will stay open through the end of finals week, which I think is through Wednesday or Thursday of next week, if I'm remembering correctly. So you guys will have close to a week to do it, maybe not quite a full week, but you'll have several days in which you can get it done. And in the meantime, I will be working on your grades for SA3 and getting all the extra credit stuff graded. And I appreciate everyone's patience on that stuff. Okay, so I hope everyone's signed in at this point. Let's go ahead and jump into chapter 15. The plan is to get through it today. I'm giving a very general overview of the field of psychological treatments. So keep in mind that people spend years studying psychological treatment. People get PhDs in this stuff. This is an area of study that could encompass multiple graduate level courses, and I'm giving an overview in less than an hour. Well, actually, a little bit over an hour. do math, I promise. Just barely over an hour, I'm giving an overview of a field that people spend 2-3 years working on master's degrees and PhDs in. So with that in mind, you're getting a very surface level coverage of mental health treatment. I'm not able to go into anything close to what we would consider an in-depth look at this. And so there's a lot that I'm not going to be able to talk about. There's even stuff in the chapter that I'm not going to be able to totally get to. So this is as general of an overview as you can get and as you can do in one class meeting. All right, so this chapter looks at the treatment of mental disorders from two broad perspectives. Perspective of psychotherapy and the perspective of psychiatry. So we're going to talk a little bit about those two broad arenas of treatment. And in reality, a lot of folks who are getting treatment for mental illness receive treatment that entails treatment from both of those angles. For example, the best treatments that we have for major depressive disorder involve a combination of psychotropic medications like an antidepressant and some form of therapy, probably cognitive behavioral therapy. So oftentimes these methods are combined, and that is often a preferable way to approach the treatment of many mental illnesses. So that's something to keep in mind. So psychotherapy is usually the domain of social workers, counselors, and clinical psychologists. Psychiatry is the domain of medical doctors, psychiatrists namely. So a psychiatrist is someone who has an MD, they've gone through medical school, and they've specialized in psychiatry, and they can prescribe medications to treat mental illness. A clinical psychologist, on the other hand, is someone who has completed a PhD or a PsyD. Both of those are doctoral degrees in psychology that you can obtain. They're very similar. They're just slightly different ways of doing a doctoral degree in psychology. But clinical psychologists are folks who usually have a PhD or PsyD, and these are folks who have gone through a lot of graduate training and they have a doctoral degree, but it's not a medical degree. So they can diagnose mental illness and they can treat mental illness through psychotherapy, but clinical psychologists typically cannot prescribe medications like a psychiatrist can. So I'll come back to that distinction later in the chapter, and that's quite okay, Kayla, no worries. I'm not stressing. I don't want you to stress over it either. So that's an important distinction to be aware of off the bat. So we'll spend a little bit of time first talking about the domain of of psychotherapy, and then we'll get to psychiatry. So broadly speaking, psychiatry refers to any attempt to treat mental illness that comes from the angle of talk therapy, meaning that there is a therapeutic relationship that the therapist attempts to form with the client, and they form, to some degree, an emotional and interpersonal bond that results in a meaningful exchange of thoughts and ideas that lead to an improvement in the person's condition. So this is the domain of counseling, this is the domain of social workers, this is the domain of clinical psychologists. There are a few different professions that you could count under this umbrella of psychotherapy, but it's treatment that involves talk therapy. So the goal is to form a therapeutic relationship between the client and the therapist, and the goal is to change the way the client thinks about things, to change the way the client behaves in some fundamental way, and ultimately to make them feel better about whatever it is that's bothering them and causing them distress. So psychotherapy is a very broad term, and there are a lot of different approaches to psychotherapy in terms of theory. So we're going to talk about the major ones today, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the different types of psychotherapy approaches that exist out there. These are the most well-known ones. These are the ones that have been the most influential in the history of psychology. And some of these, in fact, all of these theoretical approaches we've talked about already in this class. So there shouldn't be any new theoretical approaches that you haven't heard before at this point, but we're now looking at the way they approach psychotherapy. So any discussion of the historical origins of psychotherapy would be incomplete without talking about Freud and the psychodynamic school of thought. Freud is often considered to be the father of psychotherapy. He was really the person who got the field off the ground, and love him or hate him, he did have some kooky, quacky ideas as we've explored in this class. Freud does get credit for getting the field of psychotherapy off the ground. But it was actually his mentor, Joseph Breuer, who was one of his mentors in medical school, who actually came up with the original idea of what Breuer originally referred to as the talking cure. But Breuer really didn't take the idea very far. It was Breuer who kind of discovered that just talking to clients about what was bothering them could help them feel better. But he really didn't fully develop this idea. He didn't take it very far, but it was an idea that he shared with Freud that Freud kind of took and ran with it. So we've looked at the theoretical underpinnings of the psychodynamic approach already. And again, Freud and his disciples were all about the unconscious. So Freud was big on this idea that there's this unconscious wellspring of feelings and fantasies and fears, things that we're afraid to face, right? We've explored this idea a lot in this class. But this was Freud's foundational idea, the idea of the subconscious and of the conflict between the id, which is primarily subconscious, and the superego and the ego, which are the other structures of the self. And Freud believed that psychological distress was caused by things that were pent up in the subconscious that the person was refusing to face, right? As we've explored before. So the goal of treatment, which Freud referred to as psychoanalysis, this was the term that he used to refer to the brand of talk therapy that he developed, which is really the first real official school of thought in psychotherapy. The goal of psychoanalysis was to uncover these hidden monsters, so to speak, that were lurking in the depths of the subconscious. And as the old wisdom saying goes, monsters get smaller when they're exposed to light, and they get larger in the dark, right? I don't know if anyone's ever heard that before, but that's kind of the foundational idea behind psychoanalysis, is that you're going to expose these monsters in the subconscious to the light of day, and by doing so, you will alleviate you will reduce their power, and you will reduce that pent-up pressure, so to speak, that's caused by repressing all of these subconscious fantasies and fears and whatnot, things, whatever it is that you're refusing to face, right? So early on in his career, Freud was highly influenced by his mentor, Joseph Breuer, and also by another colleague of his by the name of Francis Charcot. And both Charcot and Breuer were big on the idea of hypnosis. So early in his career, Freud was a big proponent of the use of hypnosis to try to uncover what was in the subconscious. But Freud quickly became disillusioned with hypnosis as a psychotherapeutic method for a number of reasons. But he really discovered that it wasn't everything that he had hoped it was going to be, right? He kind of went through this progression. So the earliest thing that Freud kind of became obsessed with was cocaine. Freud discovered cocaine as a young doctor. He started using it himself, and he believed that cocaine was going to become the cure for depression. And then he became disillusioned with cocaine when he discovered its addictive and destructive properties, so he abandoned that. His next pet was hypnosis after cocaine, and then he got disillusioned with hypnosis. It wasn't everything that he had hoped for. But where he ended up settling throughout his career, so to speak, were on the two methods of free association and dream analysis. So free association was the method that Freud used in psychotherapy primarily. And this involved having the client lay down on a couch and face the ceiling or look away from the therapist, which would be either Freud or someone that was trained by Freud. And he had a lot of disciples. Freud did. It was known as the Vienna Circle, by the way, the group of psychodynamic therapists surrounding Freud. They became known as the Vienna Circle. Anyway, the method involved having the client lay down on a couch. This is where the stereotype of laying down on a couch during therapy comes from. It was actually was an idea that Freud developed. So you would lay down on a couch, face the ceiling or look away from Freud, and you would just talk about whatever came to your mind, literally whatever came to your mind, whether it was the most seemingly insignificant, random object of thought, like you were thinking about your shoelaces, or you were thinking about, some incident when you were a kid where your mother yelled at you and called you a little shit, right? From the most seemingly insignificant random memory or thought to the most significant emotionally charged thoughts and memories, right? It didn't matter. Freud wanted to hear about it. And the idea was that themes would emerge in the random mumblings and ramblings of folks free associating, that over time themes would emerge, and that you would be able to spot issues that were trying to make their way to the surface from the subconscious through the ramblings of the client in psychoanalysis, through free association. And this was a very intensive practice. Freud would have his patients meet with him 3 to 5 times a week for an hour and a half to 2 hours a session. And Freud charged $30 an hour for his services. So we're talking the 1890s, we're talking the early 1900s when Freud did a lot of his work, when he had his largest client base, when he was really making a name for himself. So $30 an hour in the 1890s or the early 1900s, if you adjust that for inflation today, that would be something like, I want to say around $200 an hour today or even more. I don't know, someone could probably look that up. I don't know what the exact figure is, but it would be at least $200 an hour today, I would guess. And I'm not a finance expert, so I don't know what the precise inflation rate would be, but $30 an hour was insanely expensive in the late 1800s, right? So this was a time-consuming, expensive practice. He was basically the only person who did what he did, or the people that he trained. He and his disciples were the only people who did this. Google says that would be about $800 an hour. Wow, it's even worse than I thought. $800 an hour. Imagine paying a therapist $800 an hour and meeting with that therapist for up to 10 hours a week, right? That's insanely prohibitively expensive, right? So all of Freud's clients were very wealthy people. In fact, some of his clients were princes and members of royal families and duchesses and dukes and, really high society sorts of folks. So insanely expensive thing to do, right? So his clients were very highfalutin, sort of high society sort of folks. And he gained quite a reputation for himself throughout the world. These days, if you go to psychotherapy without health insurance, if you go to a typical PhD clinical psychologist and you pay out of pocket, it's going to cost about $200 an hour. Yeah, these days. but if you have a decent insurance policy, it'll probably cover it. Up to so many sessions a year, depending on your policy. I know some insurance policies limit the number of sessions you can have per year. But your typical clinical psychologist these days in this area, you're going to pay about $200 an hour. If you go to somewhere like New York City or San Francisco, where the cost of living is higher, it's probably going to be like $300 an hour out of pocket without insurance. So it's expensive, but Freud was crazy expensive. And time consuming, right? But the idea was that the idea was that through your ramblings and free association, it would reveal the things in your subconscious that were trying to make their way to the surface. And another technique that Freud was a huge proponent of was dream association. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. And he believed that dreams were a really potent clue as to what was trying to make its way out of the subconscious, right? I had a really weird dream the other night, actually, and I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if it was just what I had for dinner, causing indigestion, making me have a weird dream, or if it was some meaningful thing. But I had this dream. This was like 3 nights ago, and I still haven't forgotten it because it was just so vivid. That I was at this masquerade ball somewhere in the late 1800s or early 1900s. It was like in a really fancy palace, like sort of place, like Marie Antoinette would hold. It was like this masquerade ball. And all the people attending this masquerade ball were other faculty members from Pensacola State College, dressed up in tuxedos and with masquerade masks, and we were having this masquerade ball, and all my colleagues from the department were there, and just about all the faculty members from Pensacola State, and there was classical music playing, and it was just bizarre. I don't know what to make of it. But anyway, Freud believed that dreams were this royal road to the unconscious, so to speak. And the goal of all of this was to uncover whatever subconscious conflicts were trying to make their way to the surface. And the goal was that you would alleviate this pressure being built up, and that it would eventually lead to the client becoming more self-aware about who they really were as a person, and it would allow them to work through their issues. So the thing about psychoanalysis is that the data on its effectiveness are kind of mixed, to put it politely. There's some weak evidence that it might help some people, but it's not the most research-backed form of psychotherapy by modern standards. Now, we had to start somewhere, right? So, given that it was basically the first type of psychotherapy that ever existed, it might not be terribly surprising that it might not be as scientifically informed as some of the more modern approaches to psychotherapy that we have, which I'm about to talk about. But it doesn't seem to be the most effective form of psychotherapy for alleviating things like major depression or personality disorders, or the sorts of things or anxiety disorders, or the sorts of things that people typically want help for when they go to psychotherapy. The evidence for its efficacy is relatively weak. And given that it's insanely expensive and time consuming, a lot of insurance companies these days, if not most, will not pay for psychoanalysis anymore. Insurance companies quit paying for psychoanalysis years ago. So there are still psychoanalysts out there. There are folks who still practice from a Freudian psychodynamic framework. There are still a handful of traditional psychoanalysts in practice in the world today, but it's largely fallen out of favor because it's prohibitively expensive and time consuming. Insurance tends to not want to pay for it anymore. And the type of people that can afford it are your your rich Wall Street types who have the kind of time on their hands to pay thousands of dollars a week to sit and talk to somebody for 8 to 10 hours a week, right? And lay down on a couch, and ain't nobody got the time or money for that anymore, right? So psychoanalysis has largely fallen out of favor as an approach to psychotherapy. However, I think that we need not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I think Freud should at least get a little bit of credit for this idea that a lot of folks who are dealing with mental distress, and I don't think this applies to everyone, by the way, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I think a lot of people who are dealing with psychological distress are people who have aspects of themselves that they're refusing to face. For example, I think of folks who are struggling with addiction, right? One of the hallmarks of being in active addiction is a refusal to acknowledge that you're actually an addict or an alcoholic or whatever you're addicted to, right? But that could be something that I think Freud would have something to say about, right? This refusal to acknowledge this thing about yourself that you don't want to face. I think that's particularly common with addicts. I don't think it's something that all mental illnesses are characterized by, but I think a large number of folks, not just addicts, but a large number of folks have things about themselves that they are refusing to face. And that refusal to face whatever that thing is making their life worse than it would be if they just went ahead and faced it, right? And took out their sword and faced the dragon, right? So I think there's some value to that idea, and I think Freud should get some credit for that. But with that said, Freud's approach to psychotherapy is still influential. There are a lot of folks from these other perspectives that we're about to talk about who are still highly influenced by Freud, but there aren't very many pure psychoanalysts left in the world anymore. Comments at this point? I know we have a lot to get through today, so we don't have a lot of time for discussion. But any quick comments or thoughts before we move on to humanistic therapy? A lot of good comments here in the chat about the cost of psychotherapy these days and the quality of care. So humanistic therapy is the next one I want to talk about for a minute. Michelle said, do you think that maybe it could partially have to do with the amount of medications we have nowadays compared to when Freud was around? I think that has a lot to do with it. And Freud himself even said that he believed that one day science would have an understanding of the brain that would make psychoanalysis obsolete. Freud said that point blank in his writings. He believed that one day science would understand the brain sufficiently enough so that the psychoanalytic approach would be seen as outdated and obsolete. And so yeah, he was a very intelligent man, and he had his ideas were very hit or miss, but I think he was absolutely right about that. And increasingly, mental health care is moving in the direction of becoming a brain science. And that doesn't mean it can all just be cured with medication, but what that means is that that the psychotherapies that are effective are actually psychotherapies that can actually rewire your brain, which is a fascinating thing to think about. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is actually so powerful when treating people with anxiety disorders and depression that MRI studies have shown that cognitive behavioral therapy can actually rewire the brains of individuals who undergo that therapy and approach it seriously and really dig in and do it, right? So that's astounding, right? So the humanistic approach to psychotherapy, as we've talked about before, the humanists had a much brighter view of human nature than Freud had. This is something I've talked a lot about in past lectures, so I don't want to spend too much time rehashing that. But the humanists believed that there was something inherently good in human nature, and Freud saw human beings as basically civilized animals, animals pretending to be civilized, basically. But the humanists, they thought that there was something inherent in human nature that was a striving towards self-fulfillment, a striving towards unlocking your fullest potential, what Maslow referred to as self-actualization. And as we know, as I talked about before, the two major humanistic theorists were Maslow and Rogers, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Maslow made most of his contributions in the field of motivation theory. But the other major humanistic psychologist, Carl Rogers, was the humanist who influenced psychotherapy. So the humanistic approach to psychotherapy is sometimes referred to as Rogerian therapy. It's also sometimes referred to as client-centered therapy. So those are three terms for the same thing: humanistic therapy, client-centered therapy, and Rogerian therapy. It all refers to the same idea, which is a little confusing, I know, but it's the same thing. So the humanistic approach is all about helping people unlock their fullest potential. And Carl Rogers believed that everyone had this innate wisdom within them, whereby they had the wisdom within them that just needed to be unlocked, so to speak, where they could solve whatever problems that they were trying to solve in psychotherapy. So it was really important to Rogers that his clients feel like they had a totally safe and welcoming environment in which to speak to the therapist. This was ultimately personified in his idea of unconditional positive regard. So Rogers believed that clients needed to feel completely accepted by their therapists and that they could share anything with them, literally anything, the darkest, dirtiest, nastiest, most disgusting parts of yourself that you could imagine. Rogers said that clients needed to feel that all of those things were okay to share, no matter how dark, dirty, right? And if that the client ever felt judged by the therapist, then that was going to shut down the therapeutic process. This is easier said than done. I've talked about this in the past, but clients can open up with some really dark stuff in psychotherapy. And I did a little bit of counseling work in graduate school. It's been years, but I can tell you just from my limited experience with this, and also I have probably half a dozen friends who are professional therapists who I went through graduate school with, who practice therapy professionally now. I can tell you that people open up with some dark shit in psychotherapy, right? And you really have to be able to not react in any way that makes that client feel like they're being judged or looked down upon. I mean, even the most subtle facial expression, the most subtle wince when a client shares something with you could be interpreted as judgment, right? And it could undo months of progress, according to Rogers. So the central skill that a therapist needs to have, according to Rogers, is this ability to hold their clients in unconditional positive regard no matter what they share. And I mean no matter what, you name it. The other major component is active listening. And this is another thing that's easier said than done. But this is a practice of listening very intently. Amy Rogers, you're right. But there was no D. There was no D in Carl Rogers' name. I know. But this idea of active listening, of echoing back what your client has just said to you so that you're clear on what they've said. And another thing about Rogerian therapy that's not in this slide, but might be interesting to know, is that Carl Rogers believed that therapists should be very hesitant to tell their clients what to do. A lot of folks come to psychotherapy wanting advice. They've paid, $100, $200 an hour to meet with you. You're the expert. So they expect you to have some concrete thing that you're going to tell them to do to get better, right? Well, this goes against the humanistic philosophy, because the humanists believe that every human being has this innate wisdom within them that just needs to be unlocked. So Rogers did not want to tell his clients what to do. He was very assiduous about this. And this was something that some folks find irritating about the Rogerian humanistic approach, is that a true Rogerian therapist will hardly ever tell their client what to do, even if they're begging for advice, even if they're saying, please, doc, please tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. What am I doing wrong? Just tell me, damn it, right? Rogerian therapists will not tell you what to do. The only exception to that is if you're suicidal, right? They will talk you out. They will at least attempt to talk you out of taking your own life. But with that exception, like let's say you're trying to figure out whether or not you should stay in a relationship with a significant other, and you just really are at, you know, this state of complete indecisiveness where you just feel like you don't know what to do, right? You might want your therapist to just tell you, you know, doc, should I stay with this person or not, right? What do you think? You're the expert. Well, a true Rogerian therapist will not tell you what to do. And their philosophy is that it is their job to engage you in a Socratic dialogue so that you will eventually unlock your own inner wisdom and own inner resources, that you will figure it out for yourself. But they believe that the decision needs to be the client's, and that the client needs to feel like they came to that decision, that it was their own. And the concern is that if you tell the client what to do, then eventually they might feel like, well, it wasn't their decision, they were just doing what someone else recommended, and they'll feel like the decision wasn't their own, right? So the true Rogerian therapist will be really hesitant to be directive, right? And it's this non-directive approach, which is a source of infinite irritation to a lot of clients who just want to be told what to do, damn it, right? So, you know, folks have a mixed reception to that approach. Some folks really like that approach, other folks aren't big fans of it. So people are kind of divided on the humanistic approach. Folks who are really wanting some concrete guidance and advice from a therapist, if that's what you want in a therapist, you might be better served to not go to someone who's a pure Rogerian or a pure humanistic therapist, because they're trained to avoid giving advice, right? And a lot of therapists have been influenced by this idea, by the way. Even if you're not a pure Rogerian, this idea has seeped into a lot of approaches to psychotherapy. Comments, thoughts at this point, real quick. Anybody have any? So I want to talk for a second about the behavioral approach. And this is an approach to psychotherapy which is still very hot right now, because there's a lot of good scientific evidence for its efficacy. But the behavioral approach to therapy, or behavior therapy as we call it, utilizes the methods that we talked about in chapter 6. Classical conditioning, reinforcement, punishment, observational learning, modeling, all of the stuff that we talked about in chapter 6 on learning. Those are the tools that behavior therapists use to treat what they would call behavioral disorders. So the goal of behavior therapy is to change behaviors, right? Hence behavior therapy. So they utilize all of those behavioral approaches that we talked about in chapter 6. So it's very targeted in the sense that a behavior therapist is trying to change a maladaptive behavior pattern of some kind in a client. And there are a lot of different types of behavior therapy. Probably one of the more well-known types of behavior therapy these days is applied behavior analysis, which is actually what my wife is working on her master's degree in right now at UWF. Applied behavior analysis is a form of behavior therapy that is typically used to treat children who have developmental disorders, who have severe behavioral problems, often kids on the autism spectrum. And that's the most common use for applied behavior analysis. And you utilize these methods of reinforcement, punishment, modeling, classical conditioning, even in some cases, to improve the behavior patterns of children with behavioral issues, right? That's the main use of ABA. And it's a very popular form of therapy right now for kids, particularly on the spectrum. And my wife is having a great time studying that, and she's going to make a great licensed behavior analyst when she gets done. I'm really excited to see where her career goes with that. She was a preschool teacher for almost 10 years before she went back to get her master's degree. So she wanted to grow a little bit professionally, so she went back to graduate school recently, and so she's going to become a behavior analyst. Yeah, very happy for her, and I think she's going to be awesome. She's so much better with kids than I am. Interestingly enough, neither one of us want children, though. So it's the damnedest thing, right? We like kids, we have fun with kids when we're around them, but then we like to give them back to their parents when we're done. We don't want any of our own. Exactly, we can give them back, right? That's the fun of it, and we don't have to pay for any of their bills, right? You just get to have the fun part. That's the way to do it. Right? I'm just kidding. For those of you who have kids, more power to you. We need good parents in the world. So that's one very popular form of behavior therapy, but there are also behavioral treatments for depression, anxiety disorders. In fact, anxiety disorders are commonly treated with a behavior therapy approach. One very common form of treatment for anxiety disorders is a method called exposure therapy, sometimes referred to as flooding. But the idea is that you expose the client to the thing that they're terrified of, let's say if it's a phobia or an OCD situation or something like that, and you repeatedly expose the client to the thing that they're afraid of without allowing them to escape from the situation. And eventually the client learns that the thing that they're afraid of isn't worthy of this level of fear that they've been giving to it, right? Another form of this is what's known as systematic desensitization, where you more gradually expose the client to the thing that they're afraid of in kind of graduated steps, and that's systematic desensitization. Very effective treatment for phobias and anxiety disorders. So a lot of the best treatments that we have for anxiety disorders are behavior therapy based, ABA like I've been talking about, and token economies are often used in residential facilities and education centers, which is a form of behavioral treatment where individuals receive tokens for good behavior, which they can later cash in. So for example, an example of this that you might see in a prison would be if a prisoner, and I don't think all prisons do this, but I think some do, some that are, have more experimental approaches. But if you have a prisoner who's been behaving really well, they get certain points or merits, you might call them, or tokens, whatever term you want to use, but they get points for good behavior, and then they can later go cash those in. And like say if there's a little grocery store in the prison, they can go cash those in for some potato chips or a pack of cigarettes or something like that. Yes, PTSD also. Yeah, bingo would be an example of that as well. But Michelle was asking about PTSD. Yeah, so actually what we were looking at, I believe I played a video a few class meetings ago with some soldiers who were being treated for PTSD, if I'm remembering correctly. In that video, what we saw was actually a behavioral therapy approach to PTSD, and where the soldiers were being asked to reimagine the event that led to their PTSD, like we saw where the person would make this recording of themselves recalling the event, and they would play it over and over again throughout the day to desensitize themselves to it. Yeah, that's definitely an example of a behavior exposure-based approach, for sure. Yeah, that's a great example, PTSD, for sure. So behavior therapy, very effective for treating anxiety disorders and behavioral issues. One of the most cutting edge treatments that we have, in addition to behavior therapy these days, is a method that's called cognitive therapy. And this is a method that's commonly used to treat depression and anxiety as well. So cognitive therapy is based on changing the way that you think about things. And if you look at folks who are depressed, and as someone who's fought depression my entire adult life, thankfully I've had it under control for a couple of good years now, and I haven't had a major depressive episode now in, I want to say, actually 3 years. So I've been in good shape for a while, but I've had some dark times with my depression, I can tell you. I won't go into too much detail there. I don't want to get too personal, but I've been through some really dark times. And one thing I've noticed about myself and other people as well who I know who struggle from depression is that when people get depressed, um, we often think about things in irrationally negative ways. We catastrophize. We engage in fortune telling. We, we think the worst of a situation for no reason when there's no reason to do so, right? There's a pattern that depressed people have of interpreting events in the most negative way possible, right? Even when the situation doesn't warrant it, right? So, we'll give you a common example in a second, but I did want to mention the two major names associated with the cognitive approach. Those are Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, and they both invented their own forms of cognitive therapy, but it's based on the same idea. Aaron Beck's version is probably the slightly more popular version, and it's called cognitive restructuring. Albert Ellis came up with a very similar therapeutic approach. He called it rational emotive therapy. But the idea is to change the way you think about things so that you replace these automatic, irrationally negative thought processes with more rational, reality-based ones. So for example, let's give a hypothetical example here. Let's say you're in the parking lot, getting out of your car at work in the morning, and your boss pulls into the parking spot next to you. She gets out of her car, and as your boss is getting out of her car and you're getting out of yours, you say, "Oh, hey, good morning, how are you?" And your boss is just really short, just uncharacteristically rude, right? Maybe just, I don't know, I'll let you use your imagination, but your boss is uncharacteristically rude, maybe even raises her voice a little bit. You're like, most of us, if we were not in a depressed state, our reaction would be something like, "Wow, what the hell was that all about?" Right? Somebody woke up on the wrong side of the bed, right? That would be sort of a normal, healthy, non-depressed response to something like that. However, someone who's going through depression is more likely to personalize that event, right? And think that they did something to deserve that rude behavior. Like, "Oh, I must be a terrible employee. I must screw up. I'm worthless. And clearly this is evidence that I'm going to lose my job very soon. And I'm about to become unemployed, and I'm going to become homeless." And you go into this whole scenario in your head where you think of all the bad things that are going to happen just because your boss was in a bad mood that morning, right? You go through this whole chain of consequences, which ends up with you being divorced, homeless, living in a ditch covered in flies, right? All because your boss was just a little bit rude to you, right? That's irrational, right? That is taking that event way further in your head than is necessary and is rational to do. But those of us, when we're depressed, that's the way we tend to interpret these sorts of events, right? And chances are you probably didn't even do anything to deserve it, assuming that you're a good, decent employee. Now, on the other hand, maybe you did screw up at work recently, and maybe there is some reason why your boss is pissed off at you. Even so, that's no reason to go all the way to homeless in a ditch covered in flies, divorced, and you don't have to go all the way from A to Z, right? Let's say you did do something that caused your boss to be miffed at you. Well, the rational way to respond to that would be to approach your boss when she's, a little bit less moody and say, look, Darlene, I'm sorry I screwed up. I know that must have been upsetting and stressful for you. I understand that I could have done better in that situation. Here's how I'm going to improve in the future. And I hope that we can move on from this. Let's shake hands and move on, right? And if your boss is a reasonable person, then that will probably be the end of it, right? And if that's not the end of it and she's not reasonable, is she someone you really want to work for anyway, right? So, there are so many rational ways that you could respond to that event that don't end up with you going in your head to, I'm going to end up living homeless, divorced, in a ditch with no career, right? You don't have to go all the way to that point. But that's the way depressed and anxious people tend to interpret these sorts of events. So the process of cognitive restructuring just simply involves replacing those negative automatic thoughts with more rational ones that are more reality-based. And this is a very effective treatment for depression and for anxiety disorders sometimes as well. And in fact, the most effective form of psychotherapy that has ever been devised, as far as we know, for treating depression and anxiety, which are the two most common forms of mental illness there are, the most effective treatment, all the research suggests, is a form of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, which, you guessed it, involves combining the behavioral approach and the cognitive therapy approach. So you combine those two approaches and you have what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is, all the research suggests, the most effective tool we have in our psychotherapy arsenal for treating mood disorders and anxiety disorders. And most insurance companies these days, this is the type of therapy that your insurance company is probably going to want you to go to, right? Because CBT usually involves seeing the therapist for maybe 8 to 10 sessions, and then it's over. Once you've learned the techniques, you can use them on yourself, and you don't need to talk to the therapist for years and years and years like you would with a humanistic therapist or with a Freudian therapist. You learn the techniques, you're done, and your insurance doesn't have to pay for you to be in therapy for the rest of your life, right? So insurance companies love CBT because there's a lot of research evidence for its effectiveness, and you don't have to be in therapy forever, right? And like I said, particularly for anxiety and mood disorders. And as I mentioned earlier, there's some decent research evidence to suggest that for many clients in MRI studies, that this can actually rewire your brain to a significant degree, meaning that the rational part of your brain, the frontal cortex, like we talked about in chapter 2, actually strengthens and has more power over the emotional part of your brain, the limbic system, like we talked about. So you're actually strengthening the rational part of your brain by retraining yourself in these ways. You're retraining yourself to behave differently, and you're retraining yourself to think differently. Very powerful psychotherapeutic approach. Of course, the downside to psychotherapy, which I've already touched on, is that it can be prohibitively expensive. Now, if you're fortunate like me and you have a good health insurance plan, Pensacola State takes really good care of us with health insurance. I'm really thankful for that. I'm fortunate that if I needed to go talk to a psychotherapist, I would probably have, 7 to 10 sessions a year covered by my insurance, which would probably be about what I would need to recalibrate. But a lot of folks, unfortunately, don't have good health insurance. And I hate that that's the reality, but that is the reality. And if you're paying out of pocket for psychotherapy, it can get very prohibitively expensive, like we talked about, right? Even if let's say you're going to a clinical psychologist with a PhD for an hour a week, that's probably $150 to $200 a week, right? Out of pocket. So you're looking at $600 to $800 a month out of pocket. There aren't a lot of folks who can afford that, right? I know I couldn't afford that. If I didn't have health insurance and I had to pay for that out of pocket, I would just never go to psychotherapy. And I'm not in therapy right now, but I have been in the past. But thankfully, I had decent health insurance. So the downside to that is the cost. So the answer to this for folks who have trouble affording one-on-one therapy is group therapy. So this is just simply psychotherapy that's delivered to more than one person at a time in the room. So the therapist can afford to charge less to each client because they've got multiple people paying, right? So if you've got 4 or 5 people in the room in the group therapy session or more, you can afford to only charge 20 or 30 bucks an hour as opposed to the $200 an hour that you might charge one person at a time. So way less expensive to do group therapy. And group therapy is usually centered on a theme. Like anger management is a common form of group therapy. Grief recovery groups. I actually have a colleague who, I don't want to violate her privacy, but this was a colleague of mine who had a guy that was obsessed with her, and she rebuffed his advances multiple times and said that she wasn't interested. And the guy ended up taking his own life in reaction to being rejected by her, right? So that, that was a traumatic thing for her, because she felt like it was her fault that this guy had taken his own life, because her rejection was the precipitating event. Now, obviously, if you look at that rationally, the guy clearly already had pre-existing issues, or he wouldn't have reacted that way to a rejection, right? We've all been rejected by someone we've been interested in, most of us, right? Unless you're the hottest person in the world and you're giftedly physically attractive. Most of us have experienced romantic rejection in our lives at least once. I know I have, right? So, and we didn't kill ourselves as a result of that, right? So this guy was clearly already unbalanced, right? But she had this immense feeling of guilt that resulted from this event, and she went into a grief recovery group to get over, I shouldn't say get over, but to get through, to get past this feeling of guilt that she had. She felt like this guy's death was her fault, right? Which obviously it wasn't. But yeah, in treatment centers, substance abuse treatment centers, like Michelle mentioned, group therapy is really popular as well. And that's actually a good point that I wanted to make, that there is a subtle distinction between support groups and group therapy. And they're very similar, actually, but the major difference is that support groups are run by lay people. So your classic example of a support group would be a 12-step meeting, right? Because those meetings are led and facilitated by members who are sober or clean from whatever addiction that group is dedicated to, right? So if you go to an AA meeting, the person running that group is a fellow alcoholic who's been sober for a while. I think the requirement is that you have to be sober for 6 months or a year or something before you can run a meeting. But I don't remember what the exact figure was on that. But so support groups are run by lay people, right? And they're incredibly useful. And I will never say a bad thing about 12-step meetings, because they're free and they're helpful, and you can benefit from the wisdom of someone who's in recovery, who has been through something very similar to what you're going through, and you don't have to pay a dime for it, right? It's totally free. Now, usually they pass an offering plate around at the end of the meeting, and you can choose to donate $1 or $2 to the group if you want to, but it's not required, right? So I'm a big proponent of 12-step groups for folks who are trying to get clean or sober. And the one thing that I might say is that if you're an addict or an alcoholic and you attend your first 12-step meeting, don't be shocked by the fact that spirituality will be something that will come up. Spirituality is an integral part of 12-step programs, and they use the word God in meetings. And this puts some people off. If you're an atheist or an agnostic, some people are put off by this. But I think if you keep an open mind and also realize that they're not promoting any particular version of God, right? So when they say God in an AA meeting, that could be a traditional Christian version of God. It could be, Judaism. It could be Islam. When you talk about God, you could just, maybe you're an atheist or an agnostic, and when you use the word God, you mean, just the universe, right, or the laws of physics. So God means different things to different people in 12-step meetings. So If you are considering checking out a 12-step meeting at some point and you're an atheist or an agnostic, like myself, I'm an agnostic, don't be put off by the religious spiritual language. They leave it to you to come up with your own interpretation of whatever that word means to you. And that was kind of I got off on a tangent there, but I'm a big fan of 12-step meetings because there are a lot of folks who benefit from them, and it's a great source of social support. And they meet on Zoom, by the way, during the pandemic. So it's important to distinguish group therapy from support groups, right? So support groups are led by lay people, but group therapy groups are led by licensed mental health professionals. That's the key difference. It's a subtle difference, but it is a key difference. Another form of therapy that's talked about in your textbook is family therapy. So this is therapy that's geared towards issues that affect the whole family, right? So we were talking about addiction treatment. So this is another great example of an issue that affects the whole family. So if you have someone in your household, whether it's a parent or a spouse or a sibling who is an addict and they're active in their addiction, this is something that affects the whole family. And I bet many of you guys are painfully aware of this fact, right? So there's a family therapy approach to substance abuse treatment involving, strategizing about how all the members of the household can be a part of that person's recovery, right? That would be an example of family therapy. Another example of a subtype of family therapy would be marriage counseling, right? Maybe you're going through or couples counseling. I shouldn't just say marriage, just couples in general. But if you're in a committed relationship and you're going through some difficulties in that relationship, then couples counseling is often a way that you can try to work through those issues. Often a lot of these issues are communication based, just couples learning to communicate with each other better and be more honest with each other about their needs. I'd say that's probably 60% of it most of the time. But that's, or you can just watch my cat bathe himself. Works for me. My cat was up here on my desk before class, but she jumped down a minute ago to go eat because she's a fat house cat. She's a happy fat cat. Or you guys would have seen her. So yeah, I love the cats. So family therapy looks at behavioral or mental health issues that affect entire families and looks to ways to resolve them. I have a calico. Yeah, she's a calico. She's got a little stripe on her nose. Maybe if I have a second, I'll go grab her. But I got a lot of stuff I gotta get through here in the next 15 minutes. Okay, so yeah, I love cats too. We also have a dog and a rabbit. We've got 2 cats, a dog, a rabbit, and a turtle. So we've got a zoo in my house. So that's we don't have any human children, but we have enough animals to form a small petting zoo, right? So when we babysit our friends' kids, they love to come over here because we have all the animals. They love the rabbit for some reason. They seem to. We do have a partridge and a pear tree, actually. It's in the backyard. Although I ate all the pears off of it. That's not true. I made that up. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's with all the cats. Yeah, we love cats. Cats are fun. You should love animals. So I want to talk a little bit about the psychiatric approach. We don't have a lot of time left, so there may be a few slides here I don't make it to. We're quickly running out of time. I want you guys to be familiar with the types of psychiatric drugs that are listed in this slide. And most of them are pretty self-explanatory, but I would like for you guys to familiarize yourself with these various classes of drugs. Anti-anxiety drugs that treat panic attacks, for example. Antidepressant drugs, which treat major depressive disorder. Most antidepressant drugs are geared towards increasing serotonin levels in the brain. The vast majority of antidepressants are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are designed to increase the neurotransmitter serotonin in the brain, which has a positive effect on mood. Some antidepressants increase dopamine levels in the brain and norepinephrine levels. So there are different types of antidepressants out there, but the vast majority of them, like Prozac, for example, or Zoloft, operate on the neurotransmitter serotonin. Wellbutrin is one of the antidepressants that increases dopamine levels in the brain. And you have Effexor, which is another atypical antidepressant, which increases norepinephrine levels and serotonin levels in the brain. So there are different types, but by and large, most of them increase serotonin levels. Mood stabilizer drugs are drugs that are designed to treat manic episodes. The original mood stabilizer was lithium, and this is still the go-to treatment for bipolar disorder is lithium. However, lithium has some nasty side effects, and if you have kidney or liver issues, then you might not be able to tolerate lithium. So as an alternative to lithium, sometimes antipsychotic drugs are used to treat mania. So some of the same drugs like Seroquel, for example, which is designed to be an antipsychotic to treat schizophrenia, some of the same drugs that are used as antipsychotics that you see listed there are sometimes used as mood stabilizers. That's why sometimes you'll see folks with bipolar disorder get prescribed antipsychotics. So when that happens, it's because that person, for whatever reason, the doctor has determined that they're not a good candidate for lithium. So your second line treatments for mania are actually antipsychotics. So your antipsychotics are drugs that are designed to treat schizophrenia, and there are two generations of antipsychotics. Before antipsychotics were invented, the treatment for schizophrenia was lobotomy, which was a procedure where the doctor would actually sterilize an ice pick. Yes, an ice pick. I'm not making this up. The doctor would sterilize an ice pick and take the ice pick in and run it around the corner of your eye, go in through your eye socket, and take the ice pick just maybe an inch behind your eye and just scrape it around a little bit, and we'll just scrape off the bottom front part of your brain, which is the, I believe it was the orbitofrontal cortex is what it's called, which is the very bottom part of the frontal lobe. And this would cause patients with schizophrenia to become very docile and compliant afterwards. It would also cause them to have a dramatic loss of IQ as well, because you're scraping off part of the brain that controls rationality. But for whatever reason, it was a somewhat effective treatment for schizophrenia, but it was just barbaric. But we don't do lobotomies anymore because the antipsychotics were invented. So the first generation antipsychotics were Thorazine and Haldol. Those are heavy duty drugs. If you're on Thorazine, then you know that you are seriously sedated. But those were the first line treatments for schizophrenia, really nasty side effects, like a condition called tardive dyskinesia, which makes people smack their lips uncontrollably. And then the second generation antipsychotics like Seroquel and Zyprexa, or what are known as atypical antipsychotics, they're antipsychotics that don't have side effects that are as nasty as the first generation antipsychotics, but they do have some nasty side effects of their own, like you see listed in this slide. And that's the problem with the treatment of schizophrenia, is that often the side effects of the antipsychotic drugs can be really nasty. Also with bipolar disorder as well. So folks who have bipolar disorder and folks who have schizophrenia are notoriously sometimes difficult to keep on their medications, because the side effects can become so severe that these individuals end up going off their meds, and they end up relapsing into a state of mania or psychotic episode. Your stimulant drugs are drugs designed to treat ADHD, your drugs like Adderall, Ritalin, for example. They're really potent stimulants. Adderall is actually amphetamine. It's just a brand name for amphetamine. And if you're really interested in this topic of your ADHD stimulant drugs, you should check out a documentary on Netflix called Take Your Pills. In fact, it would be a great candidate for the extra credit opportunity, psychology and film. It would be a great film to do your response to if you haven't already done that. It's called Take Your Pills. It's on Netflix, and it's about the history of Adderall and Ritalin, how they were developed, and the controversies surrounding their use. So check it out. It's really interesting. So that's just a quick crash course on psychotropic drugs, rather, which are your psychiatric medications. And usually you would have to go to a psychiatrist to get prescribed these, although you do see an increasing number of GPs, general practitioners, who are prescribing psychotropics, although that's controversial because they're not as trained in their use as a psychiatrist is. But if you want to get an antidepressant, for example, you probably wouldn't have any trouble getting that prescribed by your GP, your family physician. Jasmine has asked, when you relapse after stopping medication, is the mania they experience worse because they've had time away from it? You know, I don't know if it's worse, but I know it's definitely just as bad as it's always been. I mean, I have a friend who has bipolar disorder, and he treats his mania with lithium, but he often goes off of it because he's an artist and he feels like the lithium suppresses his artistic ability. So he'll go off of his lithium, and he does things that are just really regrettable when he's off his lithium. But it's kind of a catch-22 for him, right? Because painting is really, really important to him. But he feels like he can't paint when he's on his lithium. He loses his creativity, he says. Right? So he'll go off his lithium because he wants to paint, and because of the side effects. And he's just done some really regrettable things that I'm sure he wishes he hadn't done when he's gone off his meds. So yeah, bad things can happen, whether or not it's worse, like sort of a rebound effect, I think is what you're talking about. That may be the case. I don't know for sure that that's the case. But I mean, when folks go off their meds, particularly folks with bipolar disorder and folks with schizophrenia, it can be particularly bad. That's usually not a good idea. So one alternative treatment that your textbook talks about, and this is the only alternative treatment that I'm going to go into because we're about out of time, is electroconvulsive therapy. It's also known as electroshock therapy. It has kind of a bad reputation because of movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and other Hollywoodized versions of electroshock therapy. What the Hollywood version of electroshock therapy or electroconvulsive therapy doesn't tell you is that it actually has saved people's lives. And in fact, it is a last line treatment for folks who have severe depression, is what it's usually used for. These are folks who are so treatment resistant, no antidepressant seems to work, cognitive behavioral therapy isn't seeming to work, and these are people who are often suicidally depressed, and this is kind of their last ditch hope, right? That's the Obi-Wan Kenobi final hope of depression treatment. And it can actually be really a lifesaver for folks who have serious intractable depression. And it's, like I said, it's kind of a last line of treatment, and it has a bad rep because of Hollywood. But in reality, when folks are given electroshock therapy, it's done under very controlled circumstances. The person is put into restraints so they're not flailing around. The person is given a mouthpiece so they're not biting their tongue off. Often an anti-seizure medication, actually I think always an anti-seizure medication is administered before the shocks are given so that the convulsions aren't too severe. And it's very effective for a lot of the people who get it done. And there are folks who, they say it's like flicking a light switch. They just instantly become not depressed after the treatment. And the crazy thing about it is that, no pun intended, crazy. But the crazy thing about it is that we don't really know why it works. It's kind of like if you have an old an old washing machine that makes funny noises, right? And you go to your laundry room and you just kind of give it a good smack when it's making that noise and it stops making that noise. That's kind of our understanding of electroconvulsive therapy. It's like, hey brain, stop doing that, smack, right? And it stops doing that for a while. And it's like giving a technical tap to the brain. We don't really understand why it works, but it seems to work. And it seems to be effective for 6 to 8 weeks after it's done. The depression on average seems to alleviate for up to 6 to 8 weeks. So for folks who need it, it's usually done every 2 to 3 months for folks who are having a severe depression issue, for folks who really need this for a treatment. It's an interesting therapy, and it looks pretty traumatic, but it's done in a much more humane way than it used to be. Okay, so there are just a few slides left that I didn't get a chance to get to today, so I just want to briefly mention them. I want you guys to familiarize yourself with the different types of mental health treatment providers. I touched on this a little bit already when I talked about the distinction between psychologists and psychiatrists, but I didn't really get to fully jump into those different job codes, so to speak. So I want you guys to familiarize yourself with the information in this table. These are the different types of mental health treatment providers that you will typically see. And I also want you guys to familiarize yourself with the information in this last table. This is the last slide I have for you guys. This is a list of evidence-based treatments for different types of mental disorders. So based upon all the research that's been done, these are the treatments that appear to be most evidence-based for different types of mental illnesses. So I want you guys to familiarize yourself with that information as well. So Amy made a comment that is indeed true. This was our last class meeting. So I'm working on the final exam. I aim to have it published tomorrow. It'll be 50 to 60 multiple choice questions. It'll be open book, but timed. And it's been a real pleasure to be your instructor, and I'm going to miss you guys too, Amy. I have a special place in my heart for my students. I love what I do, and I always get a little bit emotional and sad on the last day of class because I really do. I have a passion for you guys and for your growth and for the subjects that I teach. So it's always bittersweet when a class comes to an end. And some of you guys, can't talk today. Some of you guys are going to have me this summer for sociology or human growth. So I am teaching sociology, intro sociology and human growth and development this summer. So if you like the way I do things, then I would encourage you to sign up for either intro sociology or human growth and development this summer. And I will be teaching psychology too, but assuming you're passing this class, and most of you are, that's a moot point. So maybe I'll see some of you guys this summer. I have a lot of open slots in my sociology and human growth sections, and those start in June. So I'd love to see you again. Yeah. So I really appreciate the kind words, guys. You guys are gonna make me tear up. I love my students, and I care about every single last one of you guys. And it's been a great semester despite all of the tumultuous upheaval caused by the coronavirus. I'm fortunate just to have such awesome students. Yeah, so that's it. I will have the I'll have the study guide and exam posted by tomorrow, and the exam will stay open for, I want to say, 5 to 6 days, so you'll have some time to get that done. I really appreciate all the positive feedback, guys. And unfortunately, there aren't any course evals this semester. The college canceled those. So if you really feel passionate about sharing your feelings about my teaching with the world, there's always ratemyprofessor.com. But unfortunately, no course evals this semester. So and which is unfortunate because I enjoy reading that feedback, and you know, I like getting the course evals, even when there's criticism, because I use that criticism to try to improve. So uh, yeah, I really appreciate you guys. So that's all I have for you guys. If you guys want to meet with me on Canvas, you know, if you just need anybody to talk to, you know, you can still reach me via email. It's rcar@pensacolaState.edu. After the Canvas course ends, if you want to try to get a hold of me and you want to have a Canvas meeting, and you just need someone to talk to because you're quarantined and you're bored, you know, I'm here. You know, we can shoot the shit. So so it's been a real pleasure, and don't forget to sign in. And I really appreciate all the kind words you guys are giving me right now at this time. And I got to start my 11 o'clock class meeting here in a minute, but we'll go ahead and call it a class meeting. You guys are free to go. And like I said, if you just need someone to talk to or whatever to chat with, we can always set up a Zoom meeting. You know, even if the class is over, you know, I care about you guys, so I'm available for that. I'll be here. So, yeah, thanks, Caleb. Take care, guys.